Now that we've walked through the various steps on how to write a response paper, I'm going to show you an example by using the paper American Jerk, How Rude But True by Karen Vaccaro. And this is actually a sample response paper based on the article American Jerk. All right, let's look at the sample essay, and I'm going to walk you through the various parts of this. In paragraph 1, what the author did not do was begin with an attention getter. I would like you to try to come with some kind of attention getter before you do anything. So let's pretend that there is some sentence or two of an attention getter. The next sentence is exactly what you will be doing in your essay. In his article, American Jerk, Todd Schwartz claims that Americans today are both the most and the least civil we have ever been. So what the author does, we have the name of the article, we have the name of the author of the original article, and then claims that, and after the word claims that, you have the main idea. So again, I want you to think about your paper and not exactly the way this one is written. In this paper, Karen Vaccaro says, although the painful truth in these observations is a bit hard to take, Schwartz eases the reality by providing a great deal of humorous relief. She gives a little bit more explanation. In your paper, after you say the main idea, I want you to do a very short summary. The author begins by, and then after that, and the author concludes by. The last sentence in the first paragraph is really the most important. That is the thesis statement. From this sentence, you should be able to figure out the position of the author and the position that she will take in the paper. Schwartz's claim is an apt one, and most of his observations about our current culture are accurate, but some of his observations and accusations are broad generalizations that don't always hold true. So in this thesis statement, we can see the position of the author. We can tell, if you look at the notes on the side of your paper, that she is mostly agreeing with the original text and with the original author, although there are some points of disagreement. So she uses the words most of his observations, and she uses some. And these are the clues that she's agreeing maybe about 75% and disagreeing 25%. You want to be able to do the same thing in your paper. You can see that she doesn't use the word agree or disagree anywhere in the thesis statement, but it is very clear what she is doing. Try to do exactly the same thing. Now let's move on to the second paragraph and see how the paper continues. So remember, this is a response paper. And we also need, at the same time, good paragraph structure. So in the second paragraph, she begins with a quote. We have never been more concerned about the feelings of minority groups, the disabled and the disadvantaged, Schwartz writes in paragraph 3. And he is right. We have become a culture obsessed with being PC, politically correct. So what she's done, she's mentioned a quote, and we can see now by saying he is right that she is agreeing. So this is beginning off of the paper of the section of agreeing. If you look at the rest of that paragraph, you will see it's paragraph 3, paragraph 3. So she has multiple examples from the same paragraph. This is a good way to organize your paper. So if you're going to go paragraph by paragraph, and you have multiple examples from one, do it like this. She goes beyond then saying that he is correct. Now she brings in, if you look down after the highlighting, she brings in her own response. I often carefully choose and often second guess the words I use to describe anyone of a different race or physical or mental ability for fear of offending anyone. And yet many people I encounter seem hardly concerned about offending me. So here she's gone beyond what the author says. She's brought in her own personal experience. She now gives a second example. Schwartz is right that, quote, We have never been less concerned about the feelings of anyone with whom we share the road, the internet, or the movie theater. End quote. Paragraph 3. Now she's going to bring again in her take of that. Cyclists seem to have taken over city streets and even shout insults at me when I am walking in a crosswalk, and they are breaking the law by ignoring a red light. Despite many methods used to discourage theatergoers from using their cell phones ring during films, concerts, and plays. In fact, last week I was at a live theater performance, and in the middle of an important one, a cell phone rang in the audience twice. So she's used two examples or two quotes from the text, but then responded to this by bringing in her own personal experience. Remember, you need to bring in personal experience in this essay because that is a big part of the rubric. Now that she's finished talking about paragraph 3, if you were to look at the original article, she moves on to paragraph 4 and finds yet another example. Because this is good writing, since it's a different paragraph that she's writing about, she also begins a different paragraph in her paper. If you look at the transitional phrase, in another example, you can tell that she has to be talking about agreeing. So in another example of how overly civil we've become, Schwartz writes, quote, "Schools won't let teachers use red pens to correct papers because self-esteem might be bruised," paragraph 4. Here she's brought in her quote, and now she brings in her own personal response to this. This reminded me of the teaching internship I did while studying abroad in China one semester. I taught an English writing course to Chinese high school students, and one day I was marking up students' papers with a red pen, as I thought teachers were supposed to do. Another American teacher said, "I thought teachers weren't supposed to mark students' papers with red pens anymore." I asked if red was offensive to Chinese students. "No," she answered. "Some of my students back home in America said it's because red is a harsh color that really stands out from the black and white." "Well, yes, I thought that was my point," I said. "But it can make some students feel bad," she responded. "That's the silliest thing I've ever heard." So you see, she really expands for one example. She takes a whole paragraph. I don't know if you're necessarily going to do that, but you still want to have a quote, and you still then want to respond to that quote. So right now we've had 2 paragraphs of her agreeing. Look now at paragraph 4. Then there are the less civil aspects of our culture, as Schwartz so accurately points out. Here again, we're moving on to the next section. She uses "then there are," so that's a nice transition, but accurately points out tells you once again that she's going to be agreeing. This time, if you skim through this paragraph, paragraph 4, you will see she's using quotes from paragraphs 7 and 8 to support her points. I would take a moment to read through that just to get a feeling of what is happening. So paragraphs 2, 3, and 4 have all been about agreeing. Now look at what she does in paragraph 5. We already know from the thesis statement that she mostly agrees with what the author wrote. So that means at some point we do have to talk about disagreement. If you look at the beginning of paragraph 5, she begins, "Where I must disagree with Schwartz, though, is his sweeping, unfounded statement that we are now living in, quote, what must certainly be the rudest error in history." So it's really in paragraph 5 that she begins to really take offense. After she talks about the history part, she then says, "Really? Are we ruder than people who enslaved others and denied them any and all rights, including the right to be treated like human beings and not animals? Are the people who refuse to shut up their inane traps," paragraph 7, "ruder than people in the time of segregation?" She then goes on a little bit to give some further response about this. But this is the one section that she just does not agree with. So in the paper, Again, she has spoken about agreeing and disagreeing. Most of it has been agreeing, except for this last section where she deals with two smaller quotes of disagreement. The last paragraph is the conclusion, and let's look at this together. Even if it doesn't fix the problems it calls attention to, Schwartz's entertaining and witty article forces us to stop and think about how contemporary American culture straddles the line between civility and rudeness. Many of his examples illustrate the hypocrisy of our behaviors and ways of thinking. Ultimately, Schwartz is correct in his claim that, quote, we have arrived at simultaneously the most and least civil moment in U.S. history. Paragraph 2. I doubt, though, that Neanderthals with their barbaric weapons and primitive hunting instincts, quote, were probably nicer to each other than we are. Paragraph 6. So you see, she sums up her ideas, basically says again her points of agreement, does give another little small quote about what she agrees with, and that is highlighted. Many of his examples illustrate the hypocrisy of our behaviors and ways of thinking. Schwartz is correct in his claim that. And then she does bring in a little bit of disagreement one more time. I doubt, though, that Neanderthals with their barbaric weapons and primitive hunting instincts, quote, were probably nicer to each other than we are, end quote. That's exactly what Schwartz says in his argument, in his paper, that we were nicer to each other, or that they were nicer to each other than we are. And this is something that the author, Karen Vaccaro, takes offense to or simply doesn't agree with. So let me recap for you some of the main points and takeaways that you should have learned from this process. There are some things that I want you to remember. Number one, make sure that you do have an attention getter first thing in your paper, even though they did not have this in the sample essay. Following the attention getter, you need to mention the author's name, the title of the text, and the main idea. Keep in mind, the author's name, you're going to use the first and last name only the first time that you mention it. After that, please only use the last name of the author. You do not need to refer to the title of the text any other time except in the beginning of your paper. After you have that, you want to have 3 to 4 what I call summary sentences. So it's a really very shortened version of a summary. So it's probably even less than the first paper that you did. Make sure that you use some transitional phrases such as the author begins by, then, after that, and he concludes. The last sentence is really the most important. The last sentence in paragraph 1 should be your thesis statement. And make sure that your thesis states your position and to what degree. I need to know, are you agreeing or disagreeing? Are you agreeing 100% or 75% like in our sample? Or are you disagreeing? But make sure you word it in such a way so that it is clear. And try to avoid using the word agree and disagree. Also, make sure that all of the paragraphs that follow need to be organized and are organized like the sample paper. In other words, keep the agreeing parts together and keep the disagreeing parts together. And I would use the ones that you have the most of first. So if you disagree more, then start with disagreeing. If you agree more, start with agreeing, just like we did in the sample paper. For support, you want to bring in a quote and then respond to that quote. Again, look at our sample paper that we just went over, and that's what happened. Make sure to bring in personal experiences as this relates to the author's points. This is actually on the rubric, so if you do not talk about your own personal experience somewhere in the paper, you won't get full credit. Use transitional phrases. Again, on page 66 of the textbook, you have that chart with different transitional phrases. We also did the exercise in class, so use the appropriate transitional phrase. Just go back to the actual paper. When you're moving from one paragraph to the next, use a transitional phrase so that it flows nicely and it's easy to follow. And the last thing, the final paragraph, is your conclusion. And make sure you go beyond the thesis statement. Don't just talk about this, go beyond it. And this should be, again, 3 to 5 sentences in length. Now, the last part, I'm going to tell you what not to do. Don't have a quote longer than 3 lines. 3 lines is the absolute maximum length of a quote. They really should be shorter. Don't forget to use proper citations. So if you are quoting, then you need to put the page number or some kind of citations. We will cover this in class next Thursday, so don't worry about that at the moment. No short paragraphs. If you look at the rubric, it says each paragraph should be about 8 to 10 sentences long. And papers and paragraphs that are shorter than this, they get very distracting. The only exception, again, is your conclusion. That can be somewhat shorter. That means you're going to have to bring in at least 1 or 2 quotes with explanation for each of your paragraphs. You have a topic sentence that says what the paragraph is going to be about. It should basically outline whether you're agreeing or disagreeing. And then you need to have your quote and then some sentences for support. Quote and another sentence or 2 for support. And then maybe a concluding sentence and go into the next paragraph. And lastly, your paper should only be about 15% actual quotes because should be about you. You are responding to the text, but most of the paper, 85%, are your own words. And you should be using first person in this paper. So in the end, when you upload the paper, check Safe Assign and see what the report is. If you have really more than 15%, that's too many quotes. The easiest way to do it is count the number of lines that you have total, count the number of lines of quotes, and then do your division. And then you can find out exactly what the percentage of quotes to actual paper is. So I hope that this and the previous video were helpful in giving you a better understanding of how to write the response paper, how to structure it, and what to do and what not to do in it. I would like you to work on a rough draft and either Wednesday or Thursday of next week, bring that rough draft to class. Even though we haven't formatted it, you don't know the proper way to put citations yet, we will talk about that next week. But as long as you have your thoughts and have more or less the paper written in rough form, and I would probably suggest typing it, then we will be able to polish it next week in class. So you have a lot to do this weekend, but I hope you enjoy the weather and have a good weekend, and I'll see you next week.